But when it all came crashing to a very fast conclusion, 1933, the only national amendment to we've only had about 30 national amendments to our Constitution in our 230-year history. And only one of them was ever repealed by another one. And that was the Prohibition Amendment. The 18th Amendment was repealed by the 21st Amendment. It's the only time it's ever happened in American history, right? But what was pivotal to that reform was that people made a distinction between the harms of prohibition. They understood that Al Capone, the organized crime, and the violence, and the corruption, the black markets, and the bootleggers becoming role models for kids, and the shootouts on the streets, and all of that wasn't about booze. That was about a decision to treat booze as a criminal commodity, right? That distinction, and it's, by the way, why the phrase repeal prohibition in a way was so much more powerful than legalize drugs, right? You know, nobody was talking, people didn't talk about let's legalize booze, right? I mean, that was always it's the curse we live with, that we haven't had any success whatsoever in legitimizing the notion of repeal drug prohibition, right? We always get stuck talking about legalize, and that doesn't help us. So that, when the Latin American Commission 2 years ago came out with that report, they talked about the harms of prohibition. Then they said Latin America can learn from the harm reduction policies of Europe and Australia, et cetera. They said we should decriminalize marijuana, right? And they were vague about whether they meant just decriminalize possession or legalized. And then they said, break the taboo. Break the taboo on open and honest dialogue of all drug policy options. And that taboo, which operates to some extent in the media, but which really operates in government. You know, you can grab my chair over there if you like. I talked about this at the Lowy Institute, which is this, you know, you guys know what that is, and I'm talking over there later today. But I think it's true both in your country and mine, which is that there is a form of censorship and self-censorship that goes in, that happens in government and in government-funded agencies, of which much of the country can well be described, right? I mean, research institutes, people doing drug treatment research, other research, where a whole array of questions involving this end of the spectrum just don't get put on the table. What you might call inconvenient questions that might result in inconvenient answers, right? There's a way in which trying to do honest research about drug policy alternatives or even drug treatment alternatives, right? In my country, to be sure, and I think pretty much your country as well and many others, it's like trying to do honest social science research in the old Soviet Union, right? It's like you learn that there's just certain questions that the government doesn't really want asked. And that if you do ask those questions, it will not be appreciated. And that if you submit a research proposal, say it's a research place, well, it will be sent to somebody who is known to disagree with you or not like you. And it means that next year you'll be less likely to be asked to serve on a review committee yourself. And it means your phone calls won't be returned as quickly. I mean, people in government have told me that this is what they expect. When I ask people to sort of stick their neck out and join my honorary board, that's what they worry about will happen to them. And sometimes it does a bit, you know. But it's that type of, I was in Singapore a couple years ago, and a friend of mine who's an academic at Oxford but spends time in Singapore, and he just described to me, you know, it's not like we're threatening people, the government's threatening people or torturing people. They do that a little bit, but for the elites, you know, it's basically, you know, co-optation, right? No, yes, you know, it's that sort of thing. And what that does, what happens is that political blinders become a form of intellectual blinders. And at some point, people just stop even bothering to ask the question, right? Why ask it? It'll never happen. And if you start to believe it'll never happen and you never ask the question, then in fact it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle, right? And so that insistence, not unnecessarily advocating for this specific solution, but for advocating for intellectual honesty and for all options being on the table. For saying, if you believe that this prohibitionist policy is the right one, then at least have the guts and the confidence to have it compared and contrasted with other strategies. If I can discipline myself this afternoon, part of what I want to do is I want to sit down, I want to write a piece for like the Melbourne newspaper about this raid they did in Victoria, the biggest marijuana bust in history. Mazel tov. But what they should be doing, of course, is to be doing an assessment. What did this thing cost? How much did taxpayers spend? How much will it cost to prosecute and incarcerate all these sorts of people? That's first, right? Secondly, what is the consequences on the marijuana market? Is there in fact a spike in price, or is there no impact on price? What happens to marijuana consumers? Do they use less? Or do some of them end up having more alcohol or switching to harder drugs? There's some evidence from the US that periodically successful crackdowns on drugs, marijuana coming from Mexico in the 70s or Jamaica in the 80s, led to a switch to heroin in one case and cocaine in the other, right? Who benefits from this? Which criminal organizations are smacking their lips right now going, whoa, I'm glad those Vietnamese guys are out of the way because now, it's open terrain, right? So the question being, to do a real assessment of that, and meanwhile to build into that the assessment of, well, what if we had not done that raid? What if we had intervened in a different way, right? What if we had kept prohibition in place? Let's assume prohibition, but then let's adopt what you might call harm reduction policing strategies, right? Or what the Dutch called the Rotterdam apartment dealer system, which is you accept that drugs are here to stay, maybe you accept that prohibition is not going away anytime soon, and then what you figure out to do is how do you reduce as much as possible the harms involved in the drug markets, right? How do you focus police resources on taking out the bad players, the ones who are more likely to use violence, the ones who are more likely to be predatory, the ones who, by the way, take no pride in the quality of their product, the ones who are ripping off the consumers, right? And how do you look at the guys who are basically the guys not like that? The ones who are integrated in the community, the ones who know their customers, the ones who take quality in their pride in their quality of their product, the ones who watch out for people, and the ones who are not so ambitious or trying to take over the world. And how do you, is there a way for the police to effectively operate a harm reduction drug market strategy under a prohibitionist world? To some extent, they've done that with sex work at times, to some degree, maybe. I'm no expert in that area. But, there's some elements of that happening in that area, right? So, and one would say, but what about also various models of legal regulation of marijuana, right? That seems to have stalled in Australia right now. Although, quite frankly, I thought it stalled in the US 4 or 5 years ago, and it ain't stalled right now. And if it ain't stalled right now in America, I don't see why Australia can't all of a sudden turn a corner and all of a sudden things start to open up again. Marijuana use among young people goes up and down, but you got more, the people who never smoke marijuana are dying off much faster than the people who are trying marijuana are emerging. There's just a basic demographic like that. And young people are more sympathetic to legalizing marijuana, and even though, as you get older and you have children and you inevitably embrace the hypocrisy that is part of the definition of parenthood, you still got a net plus there, right? So I think that this pushing, this insistence that all options be on the table. Because in a way, there's a seat back there. There's a seat back there if you want it, in the middle. This insistence, because people can say no, no, no to a certain, initiative, just blindly sometimes. But to refuse to have an open, the whole nature of democracy, of freedom of speech, that's part of both our national traditions. The notion, John Stuart Mill, the famous British philosopher, the marketplace of ideas. These are powerful notions. When you guys figure out what you want to do about your involvement in Afghanistan or in Iraq, when you figure out what you want to do about energy, oftentimes what you try to do is have all the options on the table, at least, even you're going through the show of it. But you imagine, and people in the security agencies to have this game-playing exercises to play out different options. But on drug policy, it just doesn't seem to happen. And I think it's that push, that opening it up, because the truth is, once you really open it up, the really interesting questions, right, are over here. The scientists who keep doing the research, keep doing the same dumb, I shouldn't say dumb, some of them are okay, but the same studies, the same stuff over here, and it's like, so that's, I think, the key point I want to make right here. I'll just finish by saying the following couple of things. Part of what I've been doing while I've been here the last few days, and I'll be doing next week, is sort of goading you Australians. And part of what I'm saying is, I don't get it. Like when I first got involved in this stuff, Australia, you guys were the role models. you were the ones who embraced needle exchange and harm reduction really fast, who kept HIV rates among injecting drug users under 2% or something like that, while in America it shot up to 40 or 50% in New York and New Jersey at incredibly high rates. You essentially saved tens of thousands of lives. We let hundreds of thousands of lives, just people die, right? Not just users themselves, but their children, their lovers, whatever. I mean, Margaret Thatcher essentially embraced the Australian policy. I mean, it was a major internationally significant breakthrough and role model. And then 20 years ago, I remember I was still teaching at Princeton, Gabriel Bammer coming to visit me and talking about heroin maintenance. She's publishing one paper after another about, 20 different papers about getting a heroin trial going. It's like, wow, Australia is going to be the first one, and no. Then the Swiss kind of go, that looks good. Oh, we'll do it, and then the Dutch, and then the Germans, and the British, and the Spanish, and the Canadians, and now finally the Danes. This year the Danes just said, we're not going to do a heroin maintenance research trial. Why would we do a heroin maintenance research trial? All the evidence is in already, and there's no evidence that the Danes are so different than anybody else that what worked there won't work here. So why spend the money on the research trial? And besides, from an ethical point of view, how do you create a control group that's not getting heroin when you already have the evidence that the heroin is going to lead to better results and that consigning people to the control group could be consigning them to getting dead, right? So what I'm wondering about is, how nice it would be if Australia sort of were to leapfrog to the front of the pack again. I mean, the Dutch you guys took the lead in the early 80s on this stuff, the Dutch on cannabis and some other stuff, then the Swiss took the lead. I mean, this is kind of like a handing off a baton thing. Also the Portuguese, who would think the Portuguese, right? Those are the Portuguese, who knew, right? I mean, they decriminalized, they decriminalized drug possession 9 years ago. There's a great report out last week in the British Journal of Criminology by Caitlin Hughes from Australia and Alex Stevens. And it just shows, by and large, it worked. Drug use did not increase among most groups, but drug-related harms decreased among most groups. So that's success. So the question is, and then America, my country. I mean, the evil empire of the global drug prohibition regime, right? I mean, the ones who have wreaked more havoc and destruction than any nation in the history of drug control times a zillion, right? But, with the marijuana thing, it's amazing. We're on the verge of, in fact, if you ask the question, where outside the Netherlands is marijuana most available legally above ground right now? The answer is America. 15 states have legalized medical marijuana. California is kind of the most open, but Colorado's sort of like that. Some of the other states are much tighter. You really have to have a serious medical condition. But there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who can now get their marijuana. You go to these dispensaries. I just was one, and I tend to go to the nice ones, where there are people business-minded but also ethically minded. But I was at one called Denver Relief in Denver 2 weeks ago. I was one called Spark in San Francisco 3-4 weeks ago. And there's the marijuana. They label it. This is how much THC. This is how much CBD. I mean, you got people. I mean, there's labeling. Now, how reliable labeling is that's still a question. But I mean, they're actually patient oriented. They have a real kind of harm reduction feel to them. But in some cases, people are making money. Some of them are pouring out their profits into the right sorts of things. But I mean, so America's doing something really interesting. Now, what's Australia going to do, right? I mean, so here's a few thoughts. The first one is, so congratulations, you got the medically supervised injection facility, which I dropped by yesterday, and it's all kosher now, and it's good. It took you 9-10 years, and you did it, right? So don't stop, right? And I understand there's going to be an election in March, and liberals take power and all this, but one thought is, there was a certain political strategy that led to the current facility. It doesn't mean that's the strategy that's going to lead to the next facility. I went to Vancouver, where there was a whole, the story, a whole huge hullabaloo, and became one of the top 2 issues in the mayoral campaign. The safe injection facility mayor won the election. Then he got booted by his own conservative party, but it's there. And then you had the drug users group, Vandu, which kind of just, went off and did their own thing for a while, and actually broke the ice, and then got displaced by the big one. But meanwhile, there's this little hospital in Vancouver where they've been doing a little safe injection facility for the last 8 or 9 years. It's like, nobody really talks about it. But it's there, if you ask, people say, oh yeah, we got one over there too, you know, it's got some people, you know, just, they come to the hospital, these are people, you know. But the question is are there other ways, right? If you think about this once again, step back, and if one says, look, we know this facility's working well, we also know it would make sense to open up a few more of these, maybe